This case takes place in the USA and spans over a number of years. On a cold November day in 1957, the police in the small town of Plainfield, Wisconsin made a discovery so vile that it would inspire horror movies for generations. This is the true story of Ed Gein. Edward Theodore Gein was born on the 27th of August 1906. He was the second of two boys, born to George and Augusta Gein. When Ed was about 8 years old in 1914, the Gein family moved to a 155-acre farm outside of Plainfield, a remote rural area in central Wisconsin. Ed's father George was a volatile alcoholic who struggled to even hold down a job. He often left the child rearing to Augusta, and when he did interact with the boys, it was with his fists. George would beat Ed and his older brother Henry, sometimes striking Ed in the head so hard that his ears would ring. By contrast, Ed's mother Augusta was the dominant force in the household. She was extremely religious and fanatically strict. She would often preach to the boys that the world was full of immoral and sinful people. In Augusta's view, all women, except herself, were fallen and impure. In her eyes, they were naturally promiscuous and instruments of the devil. She told her sons that sex and temptation lurked everywhere, and she forbade them from having girlfriends or even friends in town. Augusta even predicted that God would punish the world for its sins. She told the boys that modern women's fashion like short skirts and makeup were signs of impending doom. Despite this, Ed idolized his mother. He loved and feared her to an extreme degree. Now, there is one story from Ed's childhood that gets mentioned in some sources. According to some, Ed snuck into the farm slaughterhouse, and there he quietly watched as his mother slaughtered a pig. As the story goes, upon seeing the pig being killed, Ed had his first orgasm. In the 1930s, as an adult, Ed mostly worked as a farmhand and a handyman. He and his brother picked up the odd jobs around town to help make ends meet after their father's drinking finally caught up with him. In April of 1940, George Gein died of heart failure at 66. Ed was 34. With George gone, Augusta's hold on her sons only tightened. However, Henry voiced concerns about Ed's attachment to their mother. He found it unhealthy how he worshipped her and obeyed her every word. On the 16th of May 1944, Ed and Henry were burning vegetation on their farm, when all of a sudden, it got completely out of control. According to Ed, the two got separated in the smoke. When night fell and Henry still hadn't returned, Ed went to the authorities to report his brother missing. Now, strangely, Ed led searchers straight to Henry's body, which was found lying face down on a scorched patch of land. Though Henry had some minor burns, they weren't severe enough to cause his death. The coroner listed the cause of death as asphyxiation due to smoke inhalation, possibly combined with heart failure, and so officials ruled it as an accident. However, some people who were present later noted that Henry had some mysterious marks on his head, details that fueled later suspicion that Ed may have killed his own brother. Henry's death was officially recorded as a tragic accident, but forever shrouded in doubt. Henry's mysterious death deeply affected Augusta. Shortly afterwards, she suffered a paralyzing stroke, rendering her dependent on Ed's care. For about a year, he became her carer. Augusta briefly recovered enough that Ed could take her out of the house on one occasion. Soon after this, she had a second stroke, and her health went into rapid decline. On the 29th of December 1945, Augusta Gein died at the age of 67. Ed was completely devastated by his mother's death. The 39-year-old had never known true independence. In the big farmhouse, he now lived utterly alone. Following her death, in a bizarre act of devotion, Ed boarded up Augusta's bedroom and the other room she used in the house. He moved into a small room next to the kitchen and allowed the rest of the farmhouse to decay, but his mother's room stayed pristinely preserved. In the years after his mother's death, Ed's behaviour grew increasingly strange. He would later say that a force built up inside of him. He spent his time reading. He became obsessed with books about death, anatomy, and Nazi atrocities. He was particularly fascinated by stories of cannibals and human experiments. One real-life figure who caught Ed's interest was Isla Koch, who, as rumour had it, collected the skin of concentration camp inmates to make lampshades. Now, this did turn out to be a myth. However, Ed was greatly inspired. During this time, neighbours still saw Ed as odd, but mostly harmless. He continued to do handyman work for people in the neighbourhood, and he was even known to babysit local children. However, he was far from harmless. One local teenager who knew Ed later recalled that Ed showed him some shrunken heads that he kept at the farmhouse. Ed told this teenager that they were souvenirs sent to him by a cousin in the Philippines who fought in World War II, but in reality, Ed was indulging in some gruesome practices in secret. After his mother's death, he had been grave robbing. At night, Ed would creep into local cemeteries to exhume recently buried women whom he thought looked like his mother, and these shrunken heads belonged to victims that he had grave robbed. Ed subscribed to the local newspaper, and he closely followed the obituaries, looking for the deaths of middle-aged women. When a fresh grave of a suitable candidate appeared, Ed would wait until nighttime and then dig the body up. Ed would later claim that when he did this, he was in some kind of detached state, like something had taken over him. In some instances, Ed claimed that he snapped out of whatever trance he was in during the middle of grave robbing, got scared, and ran away. But on at least 9 occasions, he followed through and stole bodies from coffins. In Ed's mind, he was not desecrating the dead, he was trying to resurrect or become his mother. He later admitted that he wanted a sex change operation and also tried to create a woman suit made of real human skin so he could be his mother. Using real tanned human skin, Ed fashioned items ranging from clothing to furniture. He later denied having any intercourse with the bodies, explaining that they smelled too bad. But short of that, he mutilated corpses in almost every other way imaginable. For roughly a whole decade from 1947 to 1957, Ed Gein's farmhouse became a literal house of horrors. Human bones were littered around his property. He made a trash can wastebasket fashioned from human flesh, chairs made of human skin, sawed-off skull tops used as bowls and cups, clothing made from body parts, a belt made of female nipples. He even made a lampshade out of a human face. These are but a few things that were later found. But then, he moved on from grave robbing and on to murder. Ed Gein's first victim was Mary Hogan, a 51-year-old tavern owner in Plainfield. Mary was a divorced, independent woman who had moved to Wisconsin from Illinois around 1949. She ran a small tavern on the outskirts of town, but her tavern wasn't just open to anyone. She was a cautious woman, and she only served regular customers that she knew, and she kept a shotgun behind the bar for extra protection. But on the 8th of December, 1954, Mary Hogan vanished from her tavern. That afternoon, a neighbour entered Mary's tavern and found bloodstains on the floor and an empty cash register. Mary was nowhere to be seen. A search turned up a .32 caliber cartridge on the floor, suggesting that she might have been shot. But there was no body. The disappearance of Mary Hogan remained a mystery for years. Ed was actually an early suspect, due to him making a rather strange comment. After Mary went missing, he said, "She isn't missing, she's down at the farm right now." No one took him seriously. They assumed that he was just making some kind of inappropriate, morbid joke. However, he was telling the truth, and he would strike again. Ed's second victim was a 58-year-old widow named Bernice Warden. Bernice was a lifelong resident of Plainfield, and she owned a hardware store. By all accounts, she was a well-respected and loved woman in the community, and a mother of 2 grown children, a son, Deputy Sheriff Frank Warden, and a daughter. Ed Gein was familiar to Bernice. He was a customer who occasionally bought things from her store. On the 16th of November 1957, at around 5 p.m, Deputy Frank Warden stopped by to check on his mother and the store, but inside he found an alarming scene. The cash register was open and overturned, and there was blood on the floor, and most terrifying of all, his mother, Bernice, was gone. Of course, Frank immediately suspected foul play, and one name leapt to his mind. Frank recalled that Ed had been in the store the previous evening and said he'd return in the morning for antifreeze for his truck. Sure enough, in the empty store, Frank found that receipt for the gallon of antifreeze written in his mother's handwriting, and the receipt was made out to Ed Gein. With growing dread, Frank alerted his fellow officers that Ed Gein might be responsible in his mother's disappearance. That very same evening, police quickly located and arrested Ed at a grocery store. He was taken into custody without incident. Meanwhile, officers then converged on the Gein farmhouse, hoping to find Bernice. But what they found would leave them traumatized for life. Inside the woodshed, they discovered Bernice's body hanging upside down from a ceiling beam. She had been decapitated and, quote, dressed out like a deer. Her carcass had been slit open, and she had been gutted. She had been shot with a .22 caliber rifle, and her body was totally mutilated. But the horror in the woodshed was only the beginning. Upon searching Ed's house, authorities discovered the human remains and creations that he had made. Bernice's severed head was found in a burlap sack, and her hat was discovered in a plastic bag near the stove. Mary Hogan's skull and face mask were also found, confirming her fate. In total, the remains of at least 2 murdered women and parts from countless exhumed corpses littered the property. They found the human skin-covered chairs, a corset made from a female torso, face masks made from the skin of human heads, 9 human vulvas, gloves made from human skin, among many, many other horrors. The police couldn't even comprehend what they were seeing. As you can imagine, word of the Plainfield House of Horrors spread rapidly, and soon reporters descended upon the little town. It was now the epicenter of what is described as the most gruesome crime scene in American history. In custody, Ed quickly confessed, though he spoke in a detached, matter-of-fact manner. He admitted to killing Bernice Worden, although he gave somewhat of an evasive account of the circumstances. In one psychiatric interview, Ed claimed that he hadn't intended to kill her. He said he was examining a rifle on a store shelf when it accidentally fired, hitting Bernice before he knew what he was doing. Ed then dragged her body to his truck and brought it home for his usual butchering ritual. He also eventually admitted to the 1954 murder of Mary Hogan, after initially denying any memory of it. With those 2 murders accounted for, the police wanted to know if Ed was behind other disappearances or unsolved cases. Ed was a suspect in a few cold cases. For example, the disappearance of Georgia Weckler in 1947, along with 15-year-old Evelyn Hartley in 1953. He was also suspected of being involved in other cases. However, lie detector tests and a lack of any evidence eventually cleared him of any involvement. It appeared to investigators that Ed's violence was mostly focused on adult women who reminded him of his mother. He told investigators how he studied obituary notices and chose freshly buried women to dig up. He told the police that he would sometimes come out of his strange trances, surrounded by body parts, and would think to himself, "What am I doing? This is wrong." But yet, he continued. Ed also corroborated the motive behind this. He was trying to make a surrogate for his mother. He said he robbed these graves and killed these women because he wanted to recreate or replace his mother. Psychologists interpreted this as a delusional attempt to resurrect his mother, or in his own words, get another mother. He wanted to build a woman suit, a full body outfit made of human skin, so he could literally wear it and become a woman. He was subsequently diagnosed with schizophrenia and severe psychosis. They believed that Ed had been in a dysfunctional state of mind for many, many years, perhaps intensified by extreme loneliness after his own mother's death. One forensic psychologist noted that Ed experienced auditory hallucinations. People who knew Ed often recalled his odd habit of laughing to himself, as if hearing an unseen voice. Ed himself described feeling compelled by forces beyond his control. He told doctors that after his mother's death, he would hear voices telling him to get another mother, or do things to fill the void. During questioning, an officer by the name of Art Sly became enraged as he was investigating the case. On one occasion, he completely lost his cool with Ed. Overwhelmed by the horror that he had seen, Sly slammed Ed's head into a brick wall during an interrogation out of pure rage. But this violence against Ed later complicated the legal case, as Ed's initial confession was ruled inadmissible because it was obtained under duress. But by then, Ed had freely repeated much of his story to other investigators. There was never much doubt about his guilt. The real question was Ed Gein's sanity, and whether or not he would be able to stand trial. And then, after Ed's arrest, his neighbour, 50-year-old Adeline Watkins, spoke with reporters. She told them that she had been in a 20-year romantic relationship with him, claiming that on one occasion he even proposed. She described how they would go to the movies and get milkshakes, and how they bonded over their love of books. Adeline claimed that they often spoke about true crime, but she claimed that Ed never spoke about his own horrific crimes. She recalled, "We discussed every murder we ever heard about. Eddie told me how the murderer did wrong and what mistakes they had made." And here's the strange part. She even called Ed a good, sweet, kind man. Her mother even attested that Ed was always polite and had her daughter home by 10 p.m. Although, after revealing this, she soon went back on some of her claims. As the media descended upon her further, she claimed that she exaggerated and that they were not in a 20-year romance, stating that Ed was merely just a friend. It was found that she was never involved in his criminal activities, although she stood by what she said about him being a good man. Ed was soon charged with first-degree murder along with a string of other offences. He pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. Indeed, within days, doctors found him mentally unfit for trial. Ed was diagnosed as a schizophrenic and declared legally insane. Ed never consumed or was intimate with the body parts, though some tried to claim otherwise. Ed was later sent to a maximum security institution. There he would remain for the next decade, undergoing treatment and evaluation. For years, Ed Gein lived quietly in the mental hospital. By most accounts, he was a model patient, polite, unassuming, and even helpful around the facility. In 1968, after 11 years, doctors determined that Ed's condition had stabilized enough that he was competent enough to stand trial. The trial began in November of 1968. Given Ed's infamy, his defense team successfully requested a trial without jury to avoid any bias. The trial lasted 1 week. Psychiatrists testified on both sides. One doctor recounted how Ed claimed the shooting of Warden was accidental and that the gun went off in his hands whilst he was looking at it in the store. They stated that Ed wasn't even sure if he had consciously aimed at Bernice. But then another doctor for the prosecution explained the lengths that Ed went to into butchering her body and hiding it, suggesting that he knew right from wrong. In November of 1968, the judge delivered his verdict. Ed Gein was found guilty of first-degree murder. However, in a separate phase to determine his sanity, the judge concluded that Gein was not guilty by reason of insanity. The outcome was that Ed would not go to prison, but would instead spend the rest of his life confined in a secure mental hospital. Some believed that this was far too lenient. Many thought that he deserved death. He destroyed the lives of many, and left a lasting trauma on more. Some believe that Ed killed as many as 9 people, but we know for sure that he killed 2. Ed lived out the rest of his days in the mental health system, reportedly in relative tranquility. By all accounts, he was a mild, even likable inmate who caused little trouble. He even participated in some occupational therapy. He liked to spend his time painting and stone polishing. In March of 1958, his farmhouse was auctioned off, but mysteriously, it was later burned to the ground. The blaze had fully engulfed the home. The official cause of the fire was never determined, though arson was strongly suspected. When Ed was told about the fire and that his family home was destroyed, he simply shrugged and said, "Just as well." On the 26th of July 1984, Ed Gein passed away from respiratory failure due to lung cancer at the age of 77. In death, he returned to Plainfield. He was buried in the cemetery in the family plot next to his mother and his brother Henry. Over the years, morbid souvenir seekers kept chipping pieces off his tombstone until the entire stone was stolen in the year 2000. Today, Ed Gein lies in an unmarked grave in Plainfield, the town where he committed the most heinous of crimes.